Hello everyone. Welcome to week 5 of the St. Joseph Parish Philosophy course. This week we are going to talk about philosophy of nature and how it applies to man. Now in the past weeks we've really been learning about philosophy in a very speculative way. This week we're going to take that speculative knowledge, those principles of philosophy, and we're going to apply it to man. We're going to do this by looking at philosophy of nature, and we're going to come to understand and explain natural law. Through this knowledge of natural law, we are going to be able to understand several modern problems. These include contraception, suicide, and unnatural sexual acts. Now, in order to understand this, we have to start at the very root of the problem. So what is nature? Let's provide a definition for nature. Nature is simply the cause of motion. Now, remember in our past week, we talked about causality, and there was a remote cause, a principal cause, and an instrumental cause. So let's apply this idea of nature to a car. What is the principal cause of motion in a car? Now, the principal cause of motion in a car is the motor. However, there is the remote cause, which could be the agent cause, or the person who created the car and had the idea of the car in their intellect, and then assembled the car. There is a motor, which is the principal cause. It's most properly called the cause of motion, but because it is from this motor that motion is created. And then there is the instrumental cause, which would be the gears. For the gears allow the wheels to move, which moves the car. However, the gears cannot move themselves, for they only move because they are moved by the motor. Now we can apply the same principle to physical objects. Let's look at the most basic type of material being. Let's take gold or some sort of element. Now to begin with, let's look at gold through the 4 causes. So gold has a material cause, that is matter. It's a material object. It has its formal cause, which is the form of gold. It also has an agent cause, and that would be God. So God takes this concept of gold in his intellect, puts it into matter, and now you have a physical piece of gold, or a physical gold substance. Now, since this was this form existed or pre-existed in the divine intellect, gold has a purpose, which is to act as gold acts. Now, if you look at this diagram, you will see the diagram of a material substance. Now, if you look in the middle, you will see PM. That's prime matter. Now, prime matter is not a concept we've really talked about, but just think about it as matter. It is the thing that makes a material substance material. Angels don't have matter because they're not material substances. Things such as gold and the elements do. You also see NF. That stands for natural form. So in the diagram, the natural form actualizes the prime matter and permeates the entire substance. Now you will see little squares. Those squares are what we call the powers of the substance. Now, remember, gold has a certain purpose. It's supposed to act like gold. Now it has the various accidents and qualities that gold has. It's a certain color, a certain hardness, a certain shape. But goldness also performs actions to act like gold acts. For example, why does gold or any element fall downward? It's because of gravity. Now, what is gravity? In our modern understanding of gravity, we haven't really been able to fully explain what gravity is. The people propose it could be a gravitron, but that just begs the question, what causes the gravitron to move? Regardless of the instrumental causes of gravity, the principal cause of gravity is the form. So the form of each object, the form of gold, or the form of copper, or the form of the stone, is what causes those gravitational forces. Now you can see the other different squares, and those are just other powers that are caused by the form so it can move to its end. Now this chart was created by a person who was originally an engineer. Then later in his life, he became a Dominican priest. And a lot of his work was taking the modern advances in science and combining that with the Aristotelian Thomistic understanding of metaphysics. Now, when he combined these two knowledges, he did not neglect or destroy or do any violence to the Aristotelian metaphysics. Rather, he filled in the modern understanding of science underneath all different categories of the traditional metaphysics. So no violence was done to the traditional metaphysics. And that's why you see his other things such as nuclear interactions, radioactive emissions, chemical reactions, and gravitational interactions. All right, so that's the basic idea of a material substance. Let's go on to something a little higher in the material world. The next thing we're going to talk about is the most basic form of life, a plant. Now, a lot of people, when they hear the word soul, they think only man has a soul. But let's go back to the definition of a soul. This definition goes back all the way to the ancient Greeks. And the definition of a soul is the principle of life in something that is living. So most of us, when we hear the word soul, we think of something immaterial that gives a thing its life. But that's not necessarily true. So in the beginning, when people didn't know what the soul was, you read all sorts of different philosophers coming to different ideas of what a soul is. Some believed that the soul was the number of points, and the number of points a thing had made a thing living. Of course, now we look at this and we think this is ridiculous. Something that is more commonly accepted nowadays and was proposed by some of the atheist philosophers was that the soul was just the arrangement of parts. Man was just a machine, and the arrangement of parts in that machine was the soul. However, the great philosophers like Aristotle and Plato had a different idea. They realized that the soul was something immaterial. And Aristotle, through his understanding of the immaterial soul, realized that when plants and animals die, their soul simply ceases to exist. However, man's soul is intelligent and must exist, even once it has been severed from the body, or once that person has died. It is beyond the scope of this course to talk about how Aristotle was able to prove this through his philosophy, but you can find this in the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas. So we have this idea that a plant is a living thing and it has a soul. But what is it that causes this plant to be living? It is a form of the plant. Now, if you look over at this diagram, you will see that the plant has the perfections of the element, but it has additional perfections or powers represented by the squares. These powers, which flow from the form of plant, allow the plant to be living. Since these flow from the form and are not just an arrangement of material. So in order to create life, you need something that has the ability to create a soul. So if we look at the different powers, we'll see different ends. So all plants have the power to consume food and transfer that into energy and into the plant itself. They also have the power of reproduction to be fertile and multiply. Now, plants do this according to their nature. It is this intrinsic principle of the soul that causes plants to do these various things. You can also react to the environment. The leaves grow toward the sun and the roots grow toward the water. This flows from the powers of the soul, something immaterial. Now, when a rock falls to the ground or a piece of gold, it's acting according to its nature. In a sense, we can say it's following natural law. When a plant consumes nutrients or reproduces, it's also acting according to its nature. And by following that nature, we can say it's following natural law. Why? Because when God has this idea of plant, he has a purpose, an end for that plant. When we look at the way the plant is constructed, we can clearly see the intention or end which God imposed on that plant. It has the ability to keep itself in existence, to live, to consume food and help preserve its life, and also to reproduce and make more plants. Now next we have a higher form of life, animals. Now animals are different than plants because animals know things through the senses. They are sensate. They may not have all the senses, but something is an animal if it at least has one of the senses. And through these senses, it can know things in a way a plant cannot know. Now, some people will look at this and say, oh, then a Venus flytrap must be an animal, because when a Venus flytrap catches a bug, it will shut its mouth and consume it. And the answer is actually no. And the reason is because when a Venus flytrap catches a bug, it does not have actual knowledge of the bug. It doesn't have senses that give it knowledge of the thing that it is captured. Rather, it is a reflex. When we look at a very complicated system of the Venus flytrap, it has no knowledge, it just reacts. Similar to someone who hits your knee and you kick. This is not done through sense knowledge. It's just reflex to what has been done. So we can see that animals are a higher type of being and that they also follow the natural law. They, in a more perfect way, because animals do more things to care for their young. In more ways do they follow their nature, and more ways are they moved to follow the natural law. So next, we have man. Now again, you'll notice man is similar to the past being. He has perfections of the elements, the perfections of the plant, and the perfections of the animal. The philosopher, or Aristotle, defines man as a rational animal. He is an animal insofar as he is material. He has all the perfections of the animal. But he is rational insofar as he has an intellect and a will. Man can truly know and comprehend. And because he can truly know and comprehend, he has the capacity to use his will and make free choices. Now, these free choices is where man has the capacity to follow natural law or disobey natural law. A plant or animal, all their actions are guided by their nature. They can't choose to do one thing or another. They don't have a truly free will. Man can look and think about things. And even though he's pulled one way by his nature, he can act contrary to it. Let's take an example. Let's look at the intellect. When we look at the intellect, we can clearly tell the intellect is designed to know truth and to convey truth. That's the purpose of it. That's why God created it. But man often is tempted to sin. He knows it's wrong. He knows he shouldn't do that. But he has that free choice. Now, since the intellect was created for truth and to convey truth, every time man tells a lie, he is acting against his nature, or he's acting against the end, the purpose of his intellect, the final cause. Now we can apply this also to food and energy. Now man has emotions, and emotions for the most part are really directed toward good things. Man has a desire to eat. Now this desire to eat is there so that man preserves his life, he nourishes himself. However, when this emotion is excessively given into, it can become gluttony. Another example is the reproductive desires. This desire for reproduction is a good thing. It's ordered towards man's natural end to preserve the species, to be fertile and multiply. Now, if we go back to the whole preservation of species, man was created by God. God desires he exists, and man has an obligation to preserve his existence. So this means that suicide or taking of one's own life is actually a sin against one's nature. Another part of nature is that the sexual organs were designed to create, to bring forth new life. When people use these organs contrary to that purpose, they are committing sins because they are doing things contrary to the plan, to the purpose which God has bestowed on humanity. Now, there are certain times that God has determined man is not as proper or capable of bringing in children. And that is why after a certain age, people become infertile, because in their older age and their weakness, they are less likely to be able to care for their children. Now, it does not make the action sinful to perform these actions once you are infertile, as long as you are not purposely frustrating the act and making yourself infertile. For infertility at an old age is good. A natural infertility at old age is good and proper, so it doesn't allow a young child to be born to parents who are not physically capable of caring for that child. However, one could go against the natural law by having children. An example is the octomom. Now let's look at the purpose. We'll cheat a little bit and we'll go to dogmatic theology. Dogmatic theology says the primary ends of marriage is the rearing of children and instilling in them the Catholic faith. It's for their salvation and to populate heaven. Now, when we look at the octomom, we see that women are created a certain way to have a certain amount of kids. Based on their biology, they can only, in a healthy way, support so many kids. Just like a computer a laptop only has so much battery life to power so many things. One woman only has enough energy to, in a healthy manner, preserve so many children. So when this octomom, through artificial means, impregnated herself with multiple kids, she was actually going against natural law. Because the purpose of this no longer became for the good of children. As we can clearly see, woman's biology is not made to support all these children. Rather, it was some sort of publicity or some sort of selfish reason. So in this case, we have some sort of action that is contrary to nature. Another example is unnatural sexual desires for those who there is no possibility of life ever occurring. In these cases, people claim that, oh, I have a desire for this person, and God would not put this desire in me if it was not a good thing. Well, this isn't true. If we really look at our life, because of original sin, we constantly desire things that are not good. We desire to eat too much. We desire to watch TV when we should be working. We have inclinations and desires for all sorts of things that are inordinate. But what we must do is use reason. We must not base morality on how we feel, but we must look at how things ought to be and use that to determine how we ought to behave. And this applies to those unnatural actions with people who there is no potential to bring about children. Now, some people look at this and they look at the ear and they say, well, the ear is a faculty, an organ, and it's made for hearing. So if I put my finger in my ear, am I committing some sort of contraception? Now, this is a reasonable thought, but as we look very closely, that is not the case. First off, the ear is a passive organ. You don't actualize your ear, it's always listening. And there are some things that hearing can be damaging to you. And we use that organ for the sake of gaining knowledge, so we can make decisions. That's the purpose of the ear. It's an instrument ultimately for knowledge. Now, the sexual organs are different. They're not passive, they're active. Now, when we choose to activate these organs, it is necessary we do so in a manner that is proper to bring about life. Even if we lack the ability, because of old age or some sort of defect, to have children, we must always perform this action in a way that is open to life, such as Saint Elizabeth, who had life out of a miracle. Now, when we look more closely at this problem of contraception, we must also remember that in the situation of contraception, we are actively choosing to perform this action for the sake of an end. There are times where, even though someone has desired to go about, just like with hearing, we should cover our ears so we don't hear the horrible things being said. Someone may desire or propose certain sexual desires, and we must quiet and prevent the sexual desires from occurring. An example would be if someone is not your spouse desires sinful things. In this case, obviously, you would not be obligated to go about your sexual actions to fulfill the end of the sexual act. You would simply be required to quiet your sexual desires, and just like you would at times be required to cover your ears because of some sort of damage to very loud noises. All right, so we have a basic understanding of why contraception is not an actual thing. Another reason is because the ultimate end of hearing is for knowledge, and some things hearing can harm you and not help you to attain knowledge. It could be a lie or deceit. Whereas the sexual act, which is ordered toward children, to purposely frustrate that action so that you don't actually have children, you are actively participating in frustrating that faculty. All right. So we see how contraception is a problem, how it's contrary to natural law, or the very purpose of the faculties that God has given us. Now we have a basic understanding of natural law. Let's focus on something different. As we've seen natural law, how that affects us, some of us will think, how is this important to me? Why should I know this? There are a few reasons why natural law is helpful. So first off, if you really want to know moral theology, going about it by natural law is not the easiest way. You're much better off picking up a copy, a handbook on moral theology by Dominic Prumer, and very quickly you can skim through and find all your answers to your moral problems. Natural law is a much longer method of finding these truths. However, natural law is helpful in our society because natural law shows our moral obligations without appealing to revelation. So someone is a Hindu or an atheist, or someone who's spiritual but not religious, and they have a contrary view of the church's morality. You can go through natural law and you can prove that certain things are moral or immoral, not by revelation, but purely through nature. This is becoming more and more important as our society is drifting further and further away from the natural law. Now, why has our society drifted away so far from the natural law? The ultimate answer is because of modern philosophy. St. Pius X wrote a great encyclical on a modern error he called modernism. In the beginning of this encyclical, he started off talking about how modernism is, at its very core, based on philosophy. It was the modern philosophy, the philosophy of Kant and René Descartes, that destroyed all many parts of our theology and dogmatic theology. Now, what did this philosophy do that had this drastic effect? Well, under Thomism and the traditional philosophy of the church, the philosophy through which the Council of Trent used to declare the dogma of transubstantiation, has this idea of realism. It means what you see is really there. So in realism, when I look at that tree, it's a real tree. This idea of tree existed in the divine intellect, which was then put into the tree, and then my intellect took that idea or form of tree and is now in my intellect. In perfect manner, I understand the concept, the divine concept of tree. And the reason I can do this is because, as scripture says, we are created in the likeness and image of God. And that likeness and image is primarily in our intellect and our ability to know and to love. Now, modern philosophers have a very different understanding. If we look at our chart from week 1, we will see how destroying metaphysics trickles down to the other parts of philosophy. So modern philosophers are not realists, but they're idealists. What they believe is that that form isn't really there, but that I impose it. So modern philosophy says when you look out into the world, all that's really there is chaos, atoms. That's really just matter. That's all that's there. These forms, colors, qualities, those are imposed by our intellect. So this tree or this couch or this stone or this gold, that's really just chaos. But in order for my mind to interpret it, I make up the idea or form of gold or form of copper or form of tree. And that's how I understand the external world. So how does this apply to natural law? Well, remember, the efficient cause, which is God that makes a form such as gold, determines the end or the purpose of the thing. In the realist view, God is the efficient cause that creates the different forms, that imposes ends. And us looking at these forms and finding these ends is how we determine natural law. However, in modern philosophy, these forms aren't from God. These forms come from us. Man is now the efficient cause. If man is the efficient cause who creates the form, he can then determine the end or purpose of those forms and of those substances. And this is the destruction of natural law. Now, modernism, one of the problems is that things change with time. And this is why. Let me explain. So God is eternal. When God creates a form or idea, he is unchangeable. That form or concept is the same throughout all of eternity. Water is the same 100 years ago as it is now, as it is 1,000 years from now. But in the modern philosophy, those forms of man and different things around us are created by us. So a common idea is that in the early times, when man needed to populate the earth, the primary end of the sexual act, or marriage, was children, to be fertile and multiply. However, now that man has modern health and food and all sorts of modern technology, to preserve the species, it's no longer necessary to have many children as was in the past. By having 2 or 3 children, that's all that's needed to preserve a population. So since man is imposing that end or purpose on the human form, man can now say, what was once good, which was to produce children, is now no longer necessary. We can remove that as the end or purpose of the sexual organs. And thus, things such as birth control are no longer an evil, but they are seen as a good. This lack of natural law in modern philosophy had become a big problem for them morally, and they have turned to other areas to try to develop their own natural morality. And many attempts have been made and things have been tried, but really it's been quite a failure, because ultimately when you appeal to the moral foundations of modern philosophy, the foundation isn't there. There's always reasons to doubt their answer. That is why St. Pius X, in his remedy to modernism, said, we must turn to Thomism, to the philosophy and theology of St. Thomas Aquinas. And if we look at the movements, it was Father Gary Lagrange, who is revered as one of the greatest philosophers and Thomists of the 20th century. And he used his philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas to combat the modernist philosophers and theologians in the Catholic Church. I hope from this you have been able to get a basic understanding of modern philosophy, natural law, and how a corruption in metaphysics ultimately trickles down to our understanding of man. Next week, we'll be talking more about man and his intellect, and we will see how this corruption of metaphysics has drastically harmed modern psychology. That's all for this week. I hope you enjoyed the talk. If you have any questions, leave a comment below. Have a nice day.